The city buzzed with its usual rhythm, a chaotic symphony of traffic, conversations, and hurried footsteps. Matt and Sophie had lived in New York for nearly 5 years, yet there were still moments when the city seemed foreign, like a maze they hadn't quite figured out. That evening was one of those moments. It had been a long day, filled with the monotony of work and the dull ache of routine. The couple had set out for dinner, their usual haunt on the Lower East Side. But somehow, they found themselves on an unfamiliar street, a narrow alleyway that seemed to twist and turn in ways the map on Matt's phone couldn't capture. The buildings loomed overhead, casting strange shadows in the fading light, and there was an unsettling stillness to the place, as if it had been forgotten by time. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Sophie asked, glancing around nervously. Matt squinted at his phone, but the GPS signal had vanished. "I don't know, but we're definitely not far. Let's just keep walking a bit." And then, as if conjured from the fog of the night, they saw it, a small bistro tucked into the corner of the alley. Its glowing sign, Le Bistro de Rêves, flickered invitingly. The air around it smelled divine, like freshly baked bread, herbs, and something sweet, maybe caramel. The charm of the place was undeniable. Despite the alley's eerie quiet, the warm golden light pouring from the windows felt like a beacon of comfort. "Let's try here," Matt suggested, already moving toward the door. Sophie hesitated but followed. Inside, the atmosphere was cozy, with rustic wooden tables and candles flickering on each one. Soft music played in the background, and the clinking of glasses and soft laughter from other diners made it feel as though they'd stumbled upon a hidden gem. A friendly waitress greeted them, her smile wide and welcoming. "Table for two?" she asked in a thick French accent. Her attire was old-fashioned, almost from another era, but Sophie and Matt barely noticed. They were too entranced by the charm of the place. The couple was seated at a small table by the window. The menu, though limited, offered a selection of dishes that seemed both exotic and familiar. Matt chose a delicate beef bourguignon, while Sophie opted for a rich coq au vin. As they waited for their meals, they chatted idly, the warmth of the bistro lulling them into a state of ease. When the food arrived, it was beyond their wildest expectations. Each bite was perfection, an explosion of flavors that danced on their tongues. It was as if the dishes had been crafted specifically for them, tailored to their tastes in a way that felt almost intimate. "This is incredible," Matt said between bites, his eyes wide with surprise. "I've never tasted anything like it," Sophie agreed, though there was a flicker of unease in her voice. There was something about the bistro that didn't sit right with her. It was too perfect, too hidden, like a secret not meant to be discovered. But Matt, ever the skeptic, brushed it off. "It's just a lucky find, babe. Sometimes the best places are the ones you stumble upon." As they finished their meal, the waitress returned with a complimentary dessert, an exquisite creme brulee that crackled under the spoon. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but when she glanced around, nothing seemed out of place. The other diners were engrossed in their own conversations, and the staff moved gracefully between the tables. Still, the unease lingered as they paid the bill and left the bistro, stepping back into the cool night air. The alley was quiet again, the bistro's warm glow slowly fading behind them. That night, as they fell asleep in their small apartment, neither Matt nor Sophie could have anticipated the horrors that awaited them. For in the hours before dawn, their dreams turned dark, vivid, grotesque nightmares that twisted and contorted the familiar into something nightmarish. And in each dream, the bistro appeared, its once welcoming doors now looming like the mouth of some dark, insatiable creature. The first nightmare struck Matt like a cold slap to the face. He stood alone in the alley, the same one they had wandered through earlier, but it was different now, darker, more sinister. The street lights flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The bistro's sign, once warm and inviting, now flickered weakly, as though struggling to stay lit. He stepped forward, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on him. The alley stretched unnaturally long, its narrow walls closing in around him with each step. The windows of the bistro were black now, opaque, like eyes shut tight in slumber. A voice whispered from the shadows. Soft, unintelligible, but unmistakably there. He spun around, but the alley was empty. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic motion, and the air felt thick, almost alive. "Hello?" Matt called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. No answer. Just the growing hum of whispers, circling him like a predator sizing up its prey. Suddenly, the door to the bistro creaked open. Matt's heart pounded as he stepped toward it, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs moved on their own. The warm glow from before was gone, replaced by a dim, sickly light that barely illuminated the interior. He stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind him with a deafening bang. The bistro was empty, the tables and chairs abandoned as though the patrons had fled in a hurry. Plates of half-eaten food sat on tables, glasses of wine still full, untouched. The whispers grew louder, closer. "Welcome back," a voice hissed from the shadows. It was the waitress, but her face was wrong, distorted, her features twisted into an unnatural grin that stretched too far. Her eyes were black, hollow voids that seemed to pull Matt in. His heart raced, and he stumbled back, but the walls of the bistro closed in around him. The room began to warp, the walls twisting and bending like a funhouse mirror. He couldn't breathe. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was alive, pressing down on him. He screamed, but no sound came out. The waitress stepped closer, her movements jerky and unnatural, her smile never wavering. Her hand reached out, bony fingers inches from his throat. And then he woke up. Matt shot upright in bed, his body drenched in cold sweat. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, his heart pounding violently in his chest. For a moment, he couldn't tell where he was. The room was dark, and the city's familiar hum outside the window seemed foreign, distant. Beside him, Sophie stirred. "Matt? What's wrong?" Her voice was groggy, barely audible. I had the worst dream," he muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. His hands trembled. It felt so real. Sophie sat up, her eyes wide with concern. "I had a nightmare too, about the bistro." She paused, her voice shaking. "Matt, there was something wrong with that place. I could feel it." Matt nodded, his mind racing. It was just a dream, he told himself. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized it wasn't just the food or the eerie atmosphere of the bistro that had unsettled him, it was the way it had appeared, almost too perfectly, as if it had been waiting for them. They both sat in silence, the weight of their shared experience pressing down on them like a physical force. Neither of them wanted to admit it, but the bistro had left a mark on them, something that lingered in the air, even now. As the days passed, the nightmares continued, each one more vivid than the last. In every dream, they were back in the bistro, but it was never the same. Sometimes the walls bled, thick and dark, oozing from the cracks. Other times, the diners turned to stare at them, their faces melting into grotesque masks of terror. And always, the waitress was there, her hollow eyes following their every move. the nightmares began to seep into their waking lives. Matt started seeing the bistro's sign flickering at the edge of his vision as he walked through the city, only for it to vanish when he looked again. Sophie swore she could hear the sound of plates clinking and faint music whenever they passed a quiet street. It was consuming them, pulling them deeper into a nightmare they couldn't escape. And then one night, Sophie made a decision. "We need to go back," she said, her voice firm but laced with fear. "We need to find that bistro and figure out what's happening to us." Matt hesitated. The thought of returning to that place filled him with dread, but deep down, he knew she was right. Whatever was happening to them had started that night. They couldn't ignore it any longer. The next evening, they retraced their steps, wandering through the same twisted streets they had stumbled upon before. The alley was just as they remembered it, narrow and winding, the shadows stretching long in the dim light. But something was different. The bistro was gone. Matt and Sophie stood at the mouth of the alley, staring at the empty space where the bistro had been. The air felt colder here, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. Sophie took a step forward, her eyes scanning the narrow street for any sign of the place, but there was nothing, just cracked bricks, worn-down cobblestones, and the eerie silence of a forgotten corner of the city. "It was right here," Sophie muttered, her voice barely audible. "We didn't imagine it. I know it was here." Matt walked forward, squinting at the walls as if expecting the bistro to materialize out of thin air. But the more he looked, the more disoriented he felt. There wasn't even a trace of it, no sign, no smell of food, no warm light glowing through the windows. Just a solid brick wall where the entrance had been. "This doesn't make any sense," Matt said, running his hand along the cold surface of the wall. "We were here. We ate here." The longer they stood in that empty alley, the heavier the air became, thick with a suffocating tension that made the hairs on the back of Matt's neck stand on end. He glanced at Sophie, who was biting her lip, her face pale. "We need to go," she whispered, stepping back from the wall. Matt nodded, his chest tight with a sense of impending doom. They turned and quickly made their way out of the alley, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. The narrow street seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't feel right. It was as if the city itself was conspiring to keep them trapped. Finally, they emerged onto the main road, the familiar sounds of New York rushing back to greet them. The noise of cars, the chatter of pedestrians, and the distant wail of sirens, all of it suddenly felt overwhelming, too loud, too chaotic after the eerie stillness of the alley. But it was real, and that's what mattered. They had escaped. For now. That night, the nightmares came back with a vengeance. Matt found himself back in the alley, only this time, it was darker, so dark he could barely see his own hands in front of his face. The bistro's sign flickered weakly in the distance, casting an unnatural glow on the cobblestones below. As he walked toward it, the ground beneath him shifted, the stones cracking and sinking into a black abyss. The bistro loomed ahead, but something was wrong. The door was wide open, revealing nothing but a gaping black void. There were no tables, no warm lights, just an emptiness that seemed to swallow all sound, all light, everything. The air around him felt thick, as though the alley itself were breathing, alive and hungry. Matt hesitated at the threshold, but something inside him pushed him forward. He stepped into the darkness, the door slamming shut behind him with a force that shook the ground. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on all sides. And then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. From the shadows, the waitress emerged, her grin wider than ever, her eyes black as coal, boring into him. Her voice slithered through the air, sharp and mocking. "You're back," she whispered, the sound filling his head. "You can never leave." Suddenly, the floor beneath him gave way, and Matt fell, down into an endless void, his body weightless, his scream lost in the depths. Matt woke with a violent jolt, his heart pounding in his chest, his body drenched in cold sweat. The room was dark, but the familiar hum of the city outside reassured him he was safe, at least for the moment. He turned to look at Sophie, who was sitting upright in bed, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "I had the same dream," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We were back in the bistro, but it wasn't a bistro anymore. It was something else." Matt swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew exactly what she meant. The place had changed. The warm, charming facade had been nothing more than a mask, hiding something darker, something ancient. "We need help," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "This isn't just a coincidence, Matt. We were never supposed to find that place." Matt nodded, though his mind raced with questions. How could a bistro just disappear? And why were they both experiencing the same nightmares, the same terror? It didn't make sense. But deep down, he knew Sophie was right. Whatever they had stumbled upon, it was no ordinary restaurant, it was something much worse. The next day, they decided to investigate. They searched the internet, looking for any mention of the bistro or anything resembling it. Hours passed with no results, until finally, Sophie found something buried deep in an old urban legend forum. "The Bistro of Nightmares," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "An old tale about a cursed restaurant that only appears to those who are lost, looking for something they don't realize they need. It offers the most delicious meal, but the price is steep. Once you eat there, the nightmares begin, and they never stop. The bistro vanishes without a trace, and those who return to find it never come back." Matt felt a chill run down his spine. The description was eerily similar to what they had experienced, right down to the disappearing bistro and the relentless nightmares. "So what do we do now?" Matt asked, his voice hollow. Sophie stared at the screen, her expression grim. "We have to find a way to break the curse, before it's too late." But even as she said the words, Matt couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. The next few days became an unrelenting spiral of fear and desperation. Matt and Sophie were no longer sleeping, the nightmares had grown more vivid, more violent. They both felt the weight of something evil pressing down on them every time they closed their eyes. And each night, the same scenario repeated, the bistro, the black void, and the twisted grin of the waitress pulling them further into her darkness. The nightmares were just the beginning. During the day, strange things started happening. At first, it was subtle. A glimpse of movement out of the corner of their eyes. Whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The feeling of being watched. Then it escalated. Their apartment seemed to warp around them, doors creaked open on their own, shadows lengthened in impossible ways, and the once comforting space of their home became hostile. Every corner felt like it was hiding something, every mirror threatened to reveal something lurking just beyond their reflection. By the end of the week, Sophie was breaking down. She refused to sleep, sitting up through the nights with a baseball bat in hand, her eyes red from lack of rest. Matt wasn't much better. His mind was spinning with paranoia and exhaustion, and the haunting visions from his nightmares began to bleed into his waking hours. They needed answers. Desperate for a solution, Matt suggested they track down someone familiar with urban legends or curses. Sophie agreed, though the tension between them had grown thick. The shared fear had become a wedge, pushing them apart, each blaming the other for their predicament. It wasn't long before they found a man named Isaac Caldwell, a paranormal investigator with a reputation for diving into the darkest corners of the unknown. They reached out to him through an obscure online message board, and to their surprise, he responded immediately. He agreed to meet them at a small cafe in the East Village the next day. Sitting across from Isaac, Matt couldn't help but notice the man's calm, almost indifferent demeanor. His graying hair and deep-set eyes gave him the appearance of someone who had seen things most people couldn't even begin to imagine. Isaac listened to their story in silence, his fingers tapping lightly on the table as they described the disappearing bistro, the nightmares, and the growing sense of dread in their lives. When they finished, Isaac leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. "So you found the bistro of nightmares," he said matter-of-factly, as though they were discussing nothing more unusual than the weather. Sophie's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "You know about it?" Isaac nodded. "It's not the first time I've heard of it. The bistro appears sporadically across cities, always to couples, always those looking for something they don't realize they're searching for. It feeds off the emotions of the lost and desperate, and it binds itself to them through their dreams. The bistro is not of this world." Matt felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean, not of this world?" Isaac's smile faded. "It exists in a space between realities, a kind of limbo where time and place don't follow the rules we're used to. Once you've dined there, it begins to merge that limbo with your reality. It starts small, with nightmares, hallucinations, the feeling of being watched. But eventually, the two worlds overlap completely. When that happens," he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You don't come back." Sophie's face drained of color. "So how do we stop it?" Isaac looked at her, his expression serious. "There's only one way to break the connection. You have to find it again and destroy it." Matt's pulse quickened. "But we already tried to find it. It's gone." Isaac shook his head. "No, it's not gone. It's hiding. The bistro moves, shifts between places, but it always leaves a trace. There's a pattern to its appearances. If we can find out where it is now, we can stop it." Matt's heart raced with a mix of hope and dread. "How do we do that?" Isaac pulled a crumpled map of the city from his bag, laying it flat on the table. He traced his finger over certain streets, marking spots with a red pen. "The bistro has shown up here, here, and here over the years. Each time, it appeared in a different alley, but always in areas with a high concentration of lost souls, people struggling, in pain, searching for something. It feeds on that energy." Matt studied the map, his mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of what Isaac was suggesting. "So, we just, what? Wait around and hope it shows up again?" Isaac shook his head. "No, we have to lure it out. You've already been marked by the bistro. It's connected to you now. That connection will guide us to it." Sophie's eyes widened in fear. "You want us to go back? After what we've seen?" Isaac leaned in, his voice calm but firm. "If you don't, it will consume you. The nightmares will get worse, the lines between reality and that other world will blur, and eventually, you'll be lost." Matt looked at Sophie, her face a mask of fear and determination. He could see the same thought running through her mind as his. They had no choice. "Okay," Matt said, his voice steady despite the terror gnawing at his insides. "We'll do it." "What's the plan?" Isaac smiled grimly. "We wait for nightfall. That's when the bistro is most active. We'll head to the alleys where it's appeared before. With any luck, it will reveal itself." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in long, eerie shadows, the three of them ventured into the dark alleys of New York, following the map Isaac had drawn. Each step felt like a journey deeper into the unknown, the air growing colder, thicker, with every block they passed. The streets seemed emptier than usual, as if the city itself had been abandoned. The familiar sounds of traffic and distant conversations were strangely absent, replaced by the low, whispering wind that echoed through the alleyways. Matt could feel the weight of something sinister pressing down on him, growing stronger with each step. They reached the first alley marked on Isaac's map. The shadows seemed to stretch and curl in unnatural ways, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. The trio stood in silence, waiting, their breath visible in the chill night air. Then, from the darkness, came a faint light. Matt's heart skipped a beat as he recognized it, the flickering, warm glow of the bistro's sign. It was there, at the end of the alley, just as it had been the first night they stumbled upon it. But this time, the atmosphere was different. There was no charm, no warmth, only the oppressive sense of something watching them from within. "It's here," Isaac whispered, his voice tight with tension. "This is your chance." Matt and Sophie exchanged a glance. The terror in Sophie's eyes mirrored his own. But they knew they had to finish what they started. Together, they stepped toward the flickering light, the door of the bistro yawning open like the mouth of a beast waiting to devour them whole. The bistro had returned, but what waited inside was far worse than they could have imagined. The glow of the bistro's sign was dimmer than they remembered, flickering like a dying flame. As Matt, Sophie, and Isaac approached the entrance, the air seemed to thicken, growing colder with each step. A deep, oppressive silence settled around them. The once inviting facade of the bistro now appeared decayed, its windows dark and lifeless. The door, slightly ajar, creaked in the wind, as if beckoning them to step inside. Isaac took a deep breath and motioned for them to stay close. "Remember," he whispered, "this place isn't what it seems. Stay alert." Matt squeezed Sophie's hand, feeling her tremble. He wasn't sure if it was fear or the cold creeping into their bones, but he knew they had to keep moving forward. They stepped through the threshold, their eyes adjusting to the dim, golden light of the interior. The inside of the bistro was almost exactly as they remembered, the soft lighting, the elegant wooden furniture, the rustic charm. But something was terribly wrong. The air smelled musty, like decay and rot. The tables, once pristine, were now covered in dust. The fireplace, which had been warm and inviting before, was nothing but cold, gray ash. Shadows danced along the walls, unnaturally elongated, as if the room itself was alive and watching them. Then came the sound, a low, rhythmic scraping, like nails dragging along wood. Sophie froze, her eyes wide with terror. "Do you hear that?" Matt nodded, his throat dry. The sound was coming from the far end of the room, where the old waitress had first served them. His heart pounded in his chest as he led Sophie toward the noise, Isaac close behind. As they neared the back of the bistro, the scraping grew louder, more erratic. They reached a heavy wooden door, barely hanging on its hinges. Matt pushed it open, revealing a small, dark kitchen. The source of the noise was immediately clear. There, at the far end of the kitchen, was the waitress. She stood hunched over a countertop, her back to them, her gnarled hands furiously scrubbing an empty plate with a rag that was worn down to threads. Her movements were unnatural, jerky, frantic, as if she was trying to clean something that wasn't there. "Sophie," Matt whispered, pulling her closer. "We need to leave." But Sophie was transfixed, her eyes locked on the waitress. There was something about her that seemed familiar, more than just from their previous visit. Before Matt could pull her away, the waitress stopped moving. The silence that followed was suffocating. The waitress slowly straightened, her body rigid. Without turning, she spoke, her voice a low, raspy whisper. "You came back." Isaac stepped forward, his voice steady. "We're not here to stay. We want to end this." The waitress turned, revealing her face. It was grotesquely twisted, her skin sagging and rotting, but her eyes, those eyes, burned with an unnatural light. Her lips twisted into a smile, the same smile they had seen in their nightmares. "End this," she hissed. "There is no end." You were marked the moment you dined here. Matt felt his legs weaken, the weight of her words sinking in like ice in his veins. He glanced at Sophie, whose face had gone pale as a ghost. The waitress stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the fear of its prey. "Leave now, and you'll never be free," she continued, her voice dripping with malice. "Stay, and you might just survive the night." Isaac reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn journal. "This place feeds on fear, on the souls of those trapped in its web. But there's a way to break the cycle." "You're a gatekeeper," he said, looking directly at the waitress. "You're bound to this place." The waitress let out a low, guttural laugh, sending chills down Matt's spine. "You think you can free them? You're no different than the others who tried. This place doesn't let go." Isaac ignored her taunt, flipping through the pages of the journal. "There's always a way," he muttered, more to himself than to them. He found the page he was looking for, his eyes scanning it quickly. "We have to destroy the connection. The object that binds this place to their nightmares." Suddenly, the waitress's smile faded, her eyes narrowing. "You will not touch it." With a speed that none of them expected, she lunged at Isaac, her gnarled hands outstretched like claws. Isaac barely had time to react, stumbling backward as her fingers swiped through the air, missing him by inches. Matt grabbed Sophie, pulling her toward the back exit, but the door slammed shut with a deafening thud. "We're trapped!" Sophie screamed. The waitress, now snarling like a wild animal, turned her attention to Matt and Sophie. "You'll never leave. You're mine now." Matt's mind raced. If Isaac was right, the key to their escape lay somewhere within the bistro. He scanned the room frantically, looking for anything that might resemble a relic or object of power. His eyes landed on the fireplace, its mantel adorned with strange, antique items, a tarnished locket, an old key, and a cracked porcelain doll. Sophie's voice trembled. "Matt, what do we do?" "We destroy it," Matt whispered. "Whatever it is, we break it." Isaac, still wrestling with the waitress, managed to shout, "The locket! It's the locket!" Without hesitation, Matt sprinted toward the fireplace. The room seemed to warp around him as he moved, the walls closing in, the shadows reaching for him like living creatures. He grabbed the locket, his fingers trembling as he held it above his head. The waitress let out a blood-curdling scream, her body convulsing violently as she lunged toward Matt. But Isaac intercepted her, throwing his weight against her and knocking her to the ground. "Do it!" Isaac yelled. "Now!" Matt didn't hesitate. With all the strength he could muster, he brought the locket crashing down onto the stone hearth. The moment it shattered, the room erupted in a deafening roar. The bistro trembled violently, the walls cracking and splintering as the very fabric of the place began to unravel. The waitress let out one final scream, a sound so horrible it seemed to pierce through their very souls. Her body convulsed, then began to disintegrate, turning to dust before their eyes. The shadows that had once filled the room receded, and the oppressive weight that had pressed down on them lifted. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the bistro itself began to collapse. The moment the locket shattered, Matt felt the ground beneath him tremble as if the very essence of the bistro was coming apart at the seams. The walls rippled, bending and cracking like the surface of a mirror struck by a hammer. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe, but Matt didn't stop to catch his breath. He grabbed Sophie's arm and pulled her toward the nearest exit, Isaac following close behind. The bistro, once elegant and quaint, was now unrecognizable. Tables and chairs were tossed across the room as if an unseen force had swept through, and the warm lighting had dimmed to a sickly yellow, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. The air hummed with an electric tension, as though the place itself was on the verge of collapsing into nothingness. "We have to get out of here, now!" Matt shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound of the bistro groaning and splintering. Isaac, still clutching his journal, nodded frantically. "There's no time. This place is falling apart. Run!" They dashed toward the door, but just as they reached it, the ground beneath them gave way. The floorboards splintered, creating a gaping hole that yawned open like the mouth of a hungry beast. Matt yanked Sophie back just in time as the floor collapsed into a black void, swallowing everything in its path. The bistro was no longer just falling apart, it was disappearing. The once solid reality they were standing in was crumbling, unraveling at the edges like a dream fading into oblivion. And the worst part? They could feel it pulling at them, trying to drag them down into whatever dark, unknowable place existed beneath this twisted reality. "Matt!" Sophie cried, her voice trembling with fear. "We're not going to make it." Isaac scanned the room, his eyes wild with desperation. "There has to be another way out. We can't go back through the front." The kitchen door, the same one where they'd seen the horrifying waitress, stood slightly ajar. It was their only option. Without a word, they ran for it, dodging falling debris and cracks forming in the floor. Every step felt like a gamble, as if the ground beneath them might vanish at any second. They burst into the kitchen, the stench of rot and decay hitting them like a wall. The room was worse than before, the counters and cabinets warped and melting, as though the reality of the place had been stretched too thin. The waitress was gone, her presence erased along with the bistro's crumbling existence, but the danger was far from over. Isaac frantically flipped through the pages of his journal. "There's a back entrance," he muttered, his voice strained. "It leads out to an alley. If we can make it there, we might escape whatever is happening here." But as they stumbled toward the rear of the kitchen, something moved in the shadows. Matt froze, his heart hammering in his chest. Sophie clutched his arm, her eyes wide with terror. A figure emerged from the darkness. It wasn't the waitress, no, this was something else. Taller, gaunt, with hollow eyes that burned with a malevolent light. Its skin was ashen, its limbs long and unnaturally thin, like a distorted version of a human being. It moved toward them with slow, deliberate steps, as if savoring their fear. "Run!" Matt shouted, pulling Sophie behind him as Isaac shoved the kitchen door open. The alley was just a few feet away, but it felt like miles. Behind them, the creature let out a low, guttural growl that sent chills racing down Matt's spine. They stumbled into the alley, the cold night air a shocking contrast to the suffocating heat inside the bistro. For a moment, Matt thought they were safe. But when he turned back, the bistro wasn't behind them anymore. The building that had once stood there was gone, replaced by a crumbling, dilapidated ruin, as if it had been abandoned for years. "What the hell?" Isaac muttered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It's gone." Matt couldn't believe it either. The bistro, the place where they had just been trapped, had vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but an empty, decaying shell. The air was eerily still, the silence almost deafening. Sophie clung to Matt's arm, her breathing shallow and panicked. "Is it over? Did we escape?" But Matt didn't answer. His mind was racing. The bistro was gone, but the feeling of dread hadn't lifted. Something was still wrong. He could feel it deep in his gut, a gnawing sense that they hadn't truly escaped the nightmare. Isaac, still holding his journal, scanned the area nervously. "This doesn't make any sense. It's like the place was never there, but we were just inside." Suddenly, a low, rumbling noise echoed through the alley, growing louder with each passing second. The ground beneath their feet vibrated, and the walls of the surrounding buildings began to crack and crumble. It was as if the world around them was disintegrating, piece by piece. Matt grabbed Sophie's hand again, pulling her further down the alley. "We need to keep moving. We're not safe yet." They ran, their footsteps echoing in the narrow passage as the world seemed to collapse behind them. The alley twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, the buildings warping and stretching, as if reality itself was bending under the weight of the unnatural forces at play. The rumbling grew louder, and with it came a terrible realization. They hadn't escaped. The nightmare was still unfolding, and the bistro, or whatever dark entity controlled it, was still hunting them. Ahead, the alley opened up into a wide street. But what lay beyond froze them in their tracks. The bistro, impossibly, was standing there again, its sign glowing faintly in the foggy night air. "No," Sophie whispered, her voice shaking. How is it back?" Isaac's face paled as he stared at the building. "We didn't escape," he said, his voice hollow. "We never left." The truth hit them like a freight train. The bistro had never let them go. It was toying with them, pulling them deeper into its nightmarish grasp. No matter how far they ran, they were trapped in its web. As they stood frozen in fear, the door of the bistro creaked open once more, a faint light spilling out onto the street. And from within the darkness, the voice of the waitress echoed, soft and mocking. "Welcome back." Matt stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat as the door of the bistro creaked open, beckoning them back into the nightmare they had desperately tried to escape. He looked at Sophie, her face pale, eyes wide with terror, and Isaac, clutching his journal as if it could somehow protect him from the unimaginable. None of them spoke. Words were useless now, there was nothing left to say. The bistro loomed in front of them like a malevolent specter, its sign flickering faintly in the fog, whispering promises of something far worse than death. The world around them seemed to fade into nothing, leaving only the oppressive presence of the cursed restaurant. It had them, and deep down, Matt knew it had always had them. "It's not real," Sophie whispered, shaking her head as if trying to convince herself. "This can't be happening. It's just a nightmare." But Matt felt the weight of reality closing in on them. "No," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "It's real. Whatever this is, it wants us." Isaac swallowed hard, stepping back as if he could somehow distance himself from the truth. "There's no way out, is there? We're trapped." Before Matt could respond, the fog thickened, swirling around them like a living thing, pressing in from all sides. He could feel it, an oppressive force that seemed to seep into his skin, dulling his senses and blurring his mind. The air was thick with the scent of rot and decay, as though the world around them was rotting from the inside out. Suddenly, the voice of the waitress echoed from within the bistro, a soft, sing-song tone that sent chills racing down Matt's spine. "Come inside," she crooned. "Your table is waiting." Matt clenched his fists, his heart pounding in his chest. "We can't go back in there," he said, his voice firm despite the terror clawing at him. "If we go back, we won't come out." But as he spoke, he felt the pull of the bistro, a deep, primal urge that seemed to call to him from the darkest corners of his mind. It was as if the place had wrapped its tendrils around his very soul, dragging him closer with every passing second. The door yawned open, and the warm, inviting glow of the interior spilled out onto the street, promising comfort, safety, and an end to the horror. For a moment, he almost believed it. Sophie clutched his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Matt, we need to run. Now." But when Matt turned to flee, the street behind them had changed. The alley had twisted upon itself, closing off any hope of escape. The path they had taken no longer existed. The bistro had surrounded them, trapping them in a maze of its own making. There was nowhere to run. And then, as if to seal their fate, the waitress appeared in the doorway. Her hollow eyes gleamed with malevolent delight, her lips twisting into a sickly sweet smile. "You can't leave," she said, her voice almost tender. "You've already dined." You belong to us now. Matt's stomach churned. He could feel the bistro tightening its grip on his mind, warping his thoughts, twisting reality around him like a suffocating noose. He glanced at Isaac, who was staring at the bistro with wide, glassy eyes, as if he had already given up. And Sophie, her face was pale, drained of hope, her eyes haunted by the truth they had all come to realize. They were never leaving. Matt's mind raced, searching for some way out, some final shred of hope. But there was none. The bistro wasn't just a place, it was a force, a malevolent entity that had existed long before them and would continue long after. It had consumed countless others before them, and now it had chosen them. There was no escape. No waking up. He felt a strange calm settle over him, a quiet resignation that somehow dulled the terror. He had fought, struggled to escape, but in the end, it didn't matter. The bistro always won. It always would. Isaac let out a low, shuddering breath. It was in the journal all along, he said, his voice distant, as if speaking from far away. Every story I've collected, every person who vanished, they were all drawn back to the bistro. It's a cycle. A loop. Matt looked at him, his mouth dry. What do you mean? Isaac flipped open his journal, showing them the final pages, where crude sketches of the bistro were etched in trembling lines. It never existed in the real world. It's been feeding on people's fear, their dreams, trapping them in this endless nightmare. And we're the next ones in line. Matt's heart sank as he stared at the pages. The truth was undeniable now. The bistro wasn't just a cursed building, it was a living nightmare, drawing people in and trapping them in an eternal loop of terror. They were already part of it. Come inside, the waitress repeated, her voice soft and inviting. You'll feel better once you sit down. Matt turned to Sophie, his throat tight. I'm sorry, he whispered. I thought we could escape. I thought... But Sophie shook her head, a tear sliding down her cheek. It's not your fault, she said quietly. We never had a choice. With a deep breath, Matt took her hand, and together, they stepped toward the bistro. The warm light enveloped them, the scent of delicious food filling the air once more, as if nothing had ever been wrong. The door closed behind them with a soft click. And the street outside fell silent, the bistro's sign flickering faintly in the misty night, waiting for its next unsuspecting guests.